Okay, thanks so much. Thank you, Scott and Mérida English Language Library for having me. It's a real honor. The first thing I did when I came to Mérida was join the library because I was so excited. Hi, John. There are a bunch of people that love books as much as I do, so it's a real honor to be here. I'm a bookmaker, a book lover, a book collector, etc. So the other thing I want to say is this is a talk I've given before in the context of the United States, where it makes a whole lot more sense than it does here in Mexico for reasons that I'll get to at the end. So I just want to note that I actually dedicate the new book I'm here to talk about tonight to Mexico, in part because, well, I'll get into that. And I also want to let you know that I don't really credit the images in the talk. If you have any questions about where they came from, just feel free to ask me after. So, death is arguably the great mystery of human life. You and I, barring some medical miracle, will die, as has everyone who has ever lived. And it is precisely the limit of our time on Earth, a mysterious unknown, that gives life its value. Despite our enviable scientific and medical advancements, we are no closer to knowing what death means, what its purpose is, if any, or in any definitive way what happens after we die. Humans are believed by many to be the only creature to have foreknowledge of our own deaths. Social scientist Ernst Becker even postulated that this foreknowledge of our own death is the major defining characteristic of what it is to be a human, the cause of what we term the human condition. In Becker's opinion, it is foreknowledge of our own death and the need to create abstract systems that invest our lives with meaning that is the driver for all of human culture, from religion to philosophy to art. Another thing that seems to define our humanity is the making of images. Images allow us to manifest that which is unconscious and undefinable, to obliquely approach ideas that elude rational understanding, ideas that straddle paradox, ideas that are confusing, overwhelming, liminal, or incomprehensible. Many of us today think of death and beauty as completely incompatible categories, and that the viewing of dead bodies is, at best, morbid and distasteful. But this is not always the case. For many of our ancestors, death was a natural and normal part of everyday life, and this is reflected in the art, crafts, and culture of its time. My personal interest in this material began when I visited Europe for the first time, right after I graduated college as a young intellectual history graduate. And on this trip, this is actually a photo I took on this trip, I saw all of these objects in museums and churches that completely blew my mind because they entwined these seemingly paradoxical ideas of death and beauty in ways that I had never been introduced to. Traveling through the museums and churches of Germany, Poland, Austria, and Hungary, I encountered hundreds of artworks and artifacts that combined beauty and death in ways I had never imagined could exist, and which had never made a single appearance in the very many art history classes I took in high school and college. It was clear from the sheer numbers and ubiquity of these examples that such imagery had once been a part of everyday life. I found myself asking myself certain questions. How had our culture changed in such a way that so much of our historical record now seemed morbid? How had images such as these, and perhaps even the event of death itself, become strange to us? When and why had we changed, and what might we have lost in the process? To answer these questions, I began to collect images and information about how death had been approached in different times and places. The more I looked, the more certain I became that the way we think about death at this particular time in American culture is by far the exception rather than the rule. It seemed to me that just about every other era and culture had a set of meaningful practices with which to make sense of and develop a relationship with the great mystery of death. My interest in this material ultimately brought me to medical museums, and these are museums created ostensibly to educate medical students, but also the general public about the human body in its diseased and anatomical or normal state. And this body of research led to a photo exhibition called Anatomical Theater, which explored these museums. And my goal with this exhibition, which was exhibited in 2007 at the Alabama Museum of Health Sciences, was to approach these artifacts as artworks, expressing, even if unconsciously expressing, the concerns and beliefs about death, disease, and the body that the artists or makers might have had. In 2007, I started a blog in order to kind of make sense of all of the research and images I had amassed while I was trying to figure out how to make this exhibition. I used the name Morbid Anatomy, which was drawn from a medical term, which is the study of the diseased body. But it was also my way of trying to kind of reclaim the idea of morbid as maybe something that might have a positive aspect. The project soon expanded to an open to the public research library in New York City, and Cabinet of Curiosities. You can see there's a lot of objects in there as well. And then we started doing events, classes, and pop-ups in Brooklyn, but also all around the world. This is in London at the Old Operating Theater. This was our Krampus party. We have taxidermy classes. We still hold these taxidermy classes. And this body of research also led to a number of books, some of which are on that table right there, and even film projects. From 2014 to 2016, we even had our very own museum in Brooklyn, New York, founded with my co-founder, Tracy Hurley Martin, who has since passed, in Brooklyn, New York. And today, Morbid Anatomy continues to operate in Brooklyn, New York, a free, open to the public research library and gift shop. And we produce field trips and pop-ups around the world, including here in Mexico. We also host an online journal where we archive recordings of our weekly lecture series and have different sorts of articles and virtual tours. And we have many, many, many online and in-person classes, workshops, and events. So through my work with Morbid Anatomy and beyond, I had continued my investigation into art, artifacts, and histories that straddle the intersections of death and beauty, but also art and anatomy, and objective and subjective. And my goal is to try to understand them within their context, and also to try to understand why they have become so strange to us. So I want to talk a little bit about the concept of the Memento Mori. A Memento Mori, which is literally Latin for remember you will die, is a practice, object, or artwork created expressly to remind the viewer of their own death, and that it could come at any moment. By evoking a visceral awareness of the brevity of our lives, it was meant to help the viewer to remember to make choices in line with their true values. Memento Mori were a part of life in ancient Rome, where skeleton mosaics were commonly installed on the floors of drinking halls. And if you attended a feast, you might even be given one of these, which are called larva convivialis, or banquet ghosts. And in both cases, these objects or artworks were intended to express that well-known Latin adage, carpe diem, seize the day, reminding you to eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow you might be dead. Manifestations of the Memento Mori are also an important part of Buddhist practice. Sometimes a Buddhist temple has a human skeleton, and some meditations revolve around death and the decaying body. There were even art genres in the Eastern tradition focused on the decaying corpse, again meant to encourage the viewer to acknowledge their own death and the ephemerality of the body as a part of spiritual development. The Memento Mori that we're most familiar with today are artworks or objects created as part of the Christian tradition. In this case, Memento Mori were intended to have kind of the opposite meaning of carpe diem. It was more of trying to urge people to live a pious life, so you'd be ready to meet God if you died. These artworks became especially popular during 17th century Europe, when plague was still impacting the culture. And the subjects of such pieces included skeletons, decaying cadavers, skulls and crossbones, coffins, all sorts of other macabre imagery. There were Memento Mori objects for every budget and use. This is one of the most expensive. These were ivory rosary beads, which were only within reach of the wealthy. But you could also get rings, and sometimes these were even given out as funeral souvenirs. If you do a search for these online, you'll find many beautiful examples. Also, many clocks and watches playing on the association between time and death. A memento mori could even take the place of a cane handle. This is one that belonged to Charles Darwin. Book plates commonly have memento mori imagery. I'm not exactly sure why that is. There were also memento mori paintings that you could display in your home. These are just a few examples. And some of these took the form of what are called vanitas artworks. And these were popular in the 17th century, and they often take the form of still lifes. And I think it's interesting to note that still life paintings in French and other languages translates literally to dead nature, to nature morte. So there's an element of death in any still life, really. And the vanitas kind of just brings that home. So vanitas were intended to evoke the fleetingness of beauty, the ephemerality of earthly pleasures, achievement, and possession. And again, to urge the viewer to focus on the eternal rather than the momentary pleasures of life on earth in order to be ready to meet their maker. You could see this sort of vanitas imagery even in portraits to demonstrate the piousness and humility of the subject, and perhaps even as a counterbalance for the kind of vanity it might take to have commissioned a portrait of yourself in the first place. Memento mori also took the form of objets d'art of all kinds. Here's just a few examples of the most beautiful. And you can see that these are really beautifully made objects, a lot of care. These memento mori images even made their way into the scientific study of the body. This is the first modern anatomical atlas. This is Vesalius, and you can see it's a skeleton contemplating his own mortality. And here's just a few other from some very famous anatomical atlases. You also see memento mori in these places called anatomical theaters. So this is a place where, let's see if I can make this work, where people would dissect human cadavers for ticket-buying members of the general public. This is one in Leiden. And you can see these skeletons here are holding memento mori-themed banners. And here we have Adam and Eve reenacting the original sin, which was in the Christian tradition thought to have brought death into mankind, into the world. So I want to talk a little bit about the idea of psychopomps and other guides to a good death. So it is a very common belief found throughout history and all over the world that after the death of the body, the soul will journey to an afterworld or a land of the dead of some sort. And it was important in many cultures to have what is called a psychopomp. A psychopomp is literally a soul guide, and this was a figure that would help you transition successfully to your next destination. The role of psychopomp could be performed by a shaman or a priest or a priestess, or even a divinity. In ancient Greece, the god Hermes was a psychopomp, leading the souls of the deceased to the land of the dead. In some Christian traditions, the psychopomp was the archangel Saint Michael. And in some Filipino cultures, ancestral spirits, so the souls of relatives, were thought to guide you to your next destination. There were also a number of so-called books of the dead, and these were textual guides that were meant to help one achieve a good death and afterlife experience. And these books would offer advice and rituals and rites and practices that ensured that you would have the best death and post-death experience as you navigated to your next destination. One of the most famous of these books of the dead is from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition in the West called the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And passages of this book are often read aloud to the deceased in the days immediately following their death, thought to benefit their afterlife journey. In ancient Egypt, there's the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which served a very similar function. And the images and spells from this were sometimes even written on the wrappings of mummies and also painted in tombs. And there's a similar tradition in the Christian world called the Ars Moriendi, or the art of dying. And this developed in Christian medieval Europe in response to the mass death of the Black Plague. So an important element of dying well in this particular time was to have a priest come to your bedside and administer final rites. You can see here a priest is administering the extreme unction, which is a blessed oil. But during the plague, due to the sheer numbers of the people dying at that time and also the danger of being near them, and in some places they say as many as 2/3 of the population were dying, There were simply not enough priests to tend to the dying and the dead. And so these books called Ars Moriendi filled the gap. They were intended to serve as a guide for the dying, but also for their caregivers and families. And some of them, in a time before literacy was widespread, were comic book form, like you see here. So it was a friend of mine, Diana Pasulka, who was a religious studies professor. She read an early draft of my new book, Memento Mori, and she said, Joanna, what you've done is created a new Book of the Dead, a modern Book of the Dead. And so this book that I'm here to talk about tonight, which you will find on that table, is in many ways a culmination of all of this work that I've been talking about, which I've been doing for the last 20 or so years. All of this work looking at and thinking about death. And it's meant to act as a compendium of wisdom drawn from all of the cultures and thinkers that I've encountered, along with my own experience. It's also meant to act as an introduction for general readers to what I think is, at least, a very fascinating variety of ways that people have dealt with death, imagined it, befriended it, embraced it, and the book also aims to help the reader to excavate and to clarify their own personal understanding of death. The book takes its inspiration from one of my favorite books, which maybe some of you in the audience are familiar with, a book called The Artist's Way, which is a kind of a creativity self-help book. And like The Artist's Way, this book is organized into 12 thematic chapters, each of which is meant to be completed over the course of a week. The contents span the psychological to the practical, the historical to the spiritual. I include advice from contemporary death doulas, along with end-of-life planning documents, research on near-death experiences and festivals of the dead, and guides to meditation and dream work. And throughout, one of my favorite parts, and this is also drawn from The Artist's Way, I include as a textual counterpoint these quotations from a wide array of thinkers who have approached death in surprising and even inspirational ways. Each chapter ends with exercises and writing prompts, which are all aimed at helping the reader to kind of excavate their own ideas and to depotentiate fear of death. Also helping them to figure out what they want to do with their time on Earth, to compile and enact their bucket lists, to mourn their losses, and more. It's my hope that engaging with this book over a contained 12-week period will take the reader on a journey of exploration, learning, growth, and maybe even transformation. It is also my hope that it will act as a simulated near-death experience, in a sense, using a direct and playful confrontation with death to help the reader ascertain their own personal truths. My goal with this book is to help us find beauty and value in something that, in the West, in North American culture, United States culture, we have been told in so many ways has no value whatsoever. I hope it can help bring the reader to a place where we can continue to acknowledge the dark and tragic elements of death, but at the same time recognize its possibilities for beauty, for profound emotion, for wisdom, for gratitude. It is also my great hope that the contained encounter with death that the book provides will do for the reader what it has done for so many of our ancestors, helping them clarify their own truths and values and inspire them to live them out in the world. It's also my hope that the book helps to restore a sense of the profound mystery of death, one that allows the reader to approach this mystery with a sense of not just fear, but maybe also curiosity or even wonder. So to end, the images that I showed in this lecture are all artifacts from humankind's attempts to imagine death and find meaning in death. And I think the variety of approaches that you've seen in these images remind us that looking at death and finding beauty in death even was not always seen as morbid or distasteful. These images seem strange to us today, or so it seems to me, because of how much we have changed over the past 150 or so years, and the lack of a set of rituals or beliefs to prescribe death in our particular culture. For many of us in the affluent Western world, death today has become distant, exotic, and outside of our everyday experience, Due to medical and hygienic advances, life expectancy has grown considerably, which is a good thing, of course. And when somebody does die, it is usually at a hospital, after which the body is discreetly removed to a funeral home. But I think it's really important to remember that this is in stark contrast to earlier ideas of what a good death constituted, which was for many of our ancestors to die at home, surrounded by your family and loved ones. And I love this image because it really shows that the children are a part of this as well, which is almost unimaginable to us today. And after your death, you would want your body to be cleaned and dressed and laid out in your parlor for viewing. And fascinatingly, when this shift occurs culturally, the home parlor is renamed, of course, the living room, while the funeral parlor is dubbed the funeral parlor. So this is a real deliberate shift. Of course, today, most of us also no longer butcher our own animals. And we purchase our meat in these kind of abstract hygienic packages. And even our armed conflicts tend to take place overseas. So even that sort of death has become a kind of abstraction. And meanwhile, the process of mourning, which was until fairly recently a highly visible part of everyday life, with its own rituals, signifiers, and handicrafts even, has largely disappeared from view and become seen as pathological even if it goes on too long. And simultaneously, at the same time that death has moved further from our daily lives, it has also, and as far as my research, this is the first time in human history, become largely unexplained by the traditional methods by which humans have always created a sense of meaning. And this is, of course, religion, ritual, and mythology. Many people today think of themselves in the West as completely rational and non-religious and secular. Death has moved from the domain of mythology or religion to that of science. And science, of course, provides many, many facts, but not a lot of meaning. So once, and not so very long ago, death was seen as a rite of passage, and people were encouraged to keep this idea of death close at hand via practices such as the Memento Mori. Today, without the frame of religion or other meaning-making philosophies, death becomes simply life's antithesis, and its contemplation has come to be deemed simply morbid. To complicate matters further, from the perspective of science, death has come to mean not only an end, but often a failure of medical intervention, a failure in general. As death has become increasingly medicalized, rationalized, and secularized, and doctors coming in and taking the place once held by priests or shamans, it has been at the same time quietly disappearing from our daily life. And in my opinion, this silence and absence only serves to make it more powerful in our imaginations. As death becomes more outside of our daily experience, it becomes for many more and more terrifying, and yet simultaneously fascinating. But of course, despite a culture that sees death as morbid, our curiosity about what happens after we die and our imaginings about the nature of death have not disappeared, and nor can they ever disappear. How could human beings not be powerfully interested in the central mystery that each of us will experience, and whose presence defines our lives in so many ways? Instead, like other unacknowledged or suppressed psychological material, our curiosity about death has gone underground to emerge in other, less conscious, shadowy forms, often emerging in the unpoliced realms of popular culture. Today, we see our imaginings of death expressed in youth subcultures, in our films, our television, our novels, our true crime, our comics and graphic novels, and in as many of my students have pointed out, many of our video games as well. So I just want to add one final thing because we are here in Mexico. I end the book Memento Mori with a contemporary death phenomenon that I personally find very exciting, and that is the phenomenon of Santa Muerte, literally saint or holy death. And Santa Muerte is a Mexican folk saint. In 2012, it was said she had 12 million followers, and I think it's a lot higher now. Her popularity is said to be on the rise throughout the world. Santa Muerte is believed by many to be a powerful miracle worker. especially, and I think this is surprising to many of us, in the arenas of love, protection, and healing. Many of her devotees also see her, or describe her to me at least, as a loving mother and a compassionate psychopomp, again, this guide who helps guide you to the next stage of existence. She is said to be a product of the syncretization between the Spanish Catholic Grim Reaper and the death-related goddesses venerated by pre-Hispanic cultures. These figures, including Mictexihuatl, the Aztec queen of the dead, and Quitlaque, the Aztec patroness of life, death, fertility, and rebirth, represent a more complex and holistic view of death than that presented by the Christian worldview. Despite these pagan roots, so far as I've met, all of Santa Muerte's devotees see themselves as good Catholics. And I think this image really beautifully captures this. This is a shrine I saw in Puebla, and you can see Christ is in the center. You have the Virgin of Guadalupe, you have San Judas Tadeo, but then you have also these images of Santa Muerte, so they all go hand in hand. However, the church has rejected her, condemning her as satanic. Santa Muerte has also been vilified due to her association with narcos, the drug traffickers known for their spectacular violence. And although it is very true that many narcos do venerate Santa Muerte, it does not in any way follow that her devotees are necessarily criminals. My friend Eva Aridis Fuentes, who directed a film about La Santa Muerte, as she puts it, and I think this is a great point, in Italy, all members of the mafia might be Catholic, but that doesn't mean that all Catholics are mafia members. Because death is characterized by its lack of discrimination, right? Death takes rich and poor, young and old, sinful and holy. Santa Muerte is understood to embrace and accept everyone without judgment. This means she protects those whom the official church rejects. This includes sex workers, criminals, members of the LGBTQ+ community, and more. She's also understood to have a special compassion for the contingencies of life as it is lived by the poor, the oppressed, and the disenfranchised. So in other words, she can turn her eye from things you might be doing that maybe the Virgin of Guadalupe might not like so much. Santa Muerte is a personification of death, right? And when we personify or anthropomorphize something beyond our understanding, in other words, when we give something beyond our understanding human qualities, we are psychologically able to transform these abstract forces into conscious, active personalities that we can make a relationship with. Psychologically, we might look at the personification and veneration of a deity as a safe way to cultivate a relationship with powerful, larger-than-life archetypal energies. So for example, in ancient Greece, if you venerated Hades or Persephone, the king and queen of the underworld, this might have helped people to cultivate a humanized relationship with the unknowable reality of death, one in which that mystery could be contained and safely engaged with. In the Western world, our predominant personification of death has been for centuries the Grim Reaper. He is depicted often very much as you see him here, with a punitive and frightening demeanor, which is no surprise when we consider that this figure emerged during the Black Death, when death must have seemed vindictive and capricious indeed. I see Santa Muerte as a new image of death, compensating for the dominance of the traditional Grim Reaper. Where he is masculine and punitive, she is feminine and affectionate. While the Grim Reaper brings with him the threat of hell, Santa Muerte evokes an image of death as one of the natural and necessary steps in the infinitely repeating cycles of life, death, and rebirth. Santa Muerte brings death from the fearful shadows into the light of conscious awareness, where an appreciative and positive relationship with this human-centered mystery can be made. Santa Muerte also manages to render the image of death beautiful. This image, I think, really captures it. My husband and I saw this in Mexico City, and you can see she's wearing a beautiful gown. She's got this fantastic tiara. She's surrounded by all these gifts and flowers. And I think this is such a wonderful corrective to our idea of death, which is unmitigatedly ghastly and morbid. I personally love that her influence is spreading, and I'm very interested to see where she goes next. So with that, I'm going to end. I'm sorry I don't have any books to sell, but I did bring some books that people can look at. And my information is here. If anyone happens to buy one and wants it signed, they can contact me. I'm very happy to do so. So thank you so much for your attention and your interest, and I'm happy to take questions if anyone has any. Yes.